The caning of Charles Sumner in the 1850s is used today as an example to show the increasing tension between the North and the South on the topic of slavery. For many, this is the only time you hear about Charles Sumner. You learn that Sumner was an abolitionist who made inflammatory remarks about a Southern congressman, and in return, he was harshly beaten for it on the Senate floor of Congress. That is a very one-dimensional view of the man Charles Sumner. So I wanted to provide some more information about Charles Sumner and his ideological and political beliefs. 10 years before his well-known event in Congress, Sumner gave a lecture to the Boston Mercantile Library Association in February 1847. The title of the lecture was White Slavery in the Barbary States. This lecture provides quality information on the subject matter of white slaves and also quality information on Sumner's worldview based on how he presents his research. Here's a blurb of the lecture to give you an idea what it is about. Written as a condemnation to slavery in the United States, Charles Sumner discusses white slavery in the Barbary states of North Africa. This is a work that covers an important yet detailed history of contemporary Christian slavery that took place among the states of Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis from the 1600s to the 1800s. It is a study that details various sources of records and correspondence regarding piracy that led to the profitable capture of tens of thousands English, American, and Spanish Christians by the Algerine corsairs, and includes the responses by Western governmental authorities that led to its abolition. Before I give a summary of his lecture, I wanted to give essential background information about Sumner to understand the angle at which he will dispense his research to us. First, Sumner had started his political activist career only a few years before this lecture. When he gave this lecture, he was not yet a senator, but he was already known to be a radical abolitionist. As the blurb said, the only reason he did this lecture of white slavery was to condemn American slavery. This is something that he did not even attempt to be subtle about in his lecture. The next part of Charles Sumner's life that needs to be known is his religious beliefs. Sumner did attend a mainline Protestant church for a short time in his early life. When he was a teenager, however, he and his family started going to a Universalist church, King's Chapel in Boston, Massachusetts. Today, the Universalist Unitarian religion is explicitly not a Christian congregation. Since 1961, they have admitted to being an entirely different religion. However, in the early 1800s, they were still a Christian denomination, albeit a very self-admittedly liberal denomination. I am using the term liberal here to mean a rejection of tradition. During this time, the minister of King's Chapel would have been James Freeman. Freeman is remembered in the Unitarian Church for creating a revised edition of the Book of Common Prayer, but his version did not have any acknowledgement of the Holy Trinity. The preface to Freeman's updated Book on Common Prayer says, quote, "No Christian, it is supposed, can take offense at or find his conscience wounded in repeating. The Trinitarian, the Unitarian, the Calvinist, and the Arminian will read nothing in it which can give him any reasonable umbrage." End quote. Freeman was even considered traditional for his time because in his own lifetime, his sect of Unitarians, the AUA, will do away with the belief that Jesus is the Son of God. Freeman was not the only Unitarian leader that Sumner learned from. He was a close associate of Unitarian leader William Ellery Channing. Channing believed that humans could have a likeness to God if they improved themselves enough. King's Chapel says, quote, "Although Sumner did not regularly attend worship, he retained a relationship with the church throughout adulthood." End quote. Another Unitarian that Sumner got close to in a different type of way was Samuel Gridley Howe. Samuel Gridley Howe is also well remembered in the Unitarian Church because he was one of John Brown's Secret Six. That was the group that helped finance and encourage John Brown's bloody path of domestic terrorism. Charles Sumner and Samuel Howe had homosexual feelings for one another for many years, even while Samuel Howe was married to his wife, Julia Howe. Fun fact, Julia Howe was the lady who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Charles Sumner also had homosexual feelings for the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The National Park Service says the following about Charles Sumner and his relationships. Quote, "People who we consider queer today have always existed. In the 1800s, same-sex affection often took the form of romantic friendships. These ambiguous relationships allowed platonic friends to form deep physical and emotional bonds with one another, while also allowing lovers a degree of openness during a time in which homosexuality was criminalized." What I have shown and told you should be a good amount of background information to understand Charles Sumner's lecture on white slavery in the Barbary States. So let's begin the breakdown. The lecture has very good information throughout the entirety of it, but at the end, Sumner starts to make claims that are easily proven to be false. The beginning of his lecture starts off with a memorable quote. Quote, "If this subject should fail in interest, it cannot in novelty. I am not aware that any person has ever before attempted to combine in a connected essay the scattered materials with regard to it." End quote. I can confirm this statement to be true because I found this lecture because there is not a lot of information about white slavery, specifically in the Barbary States. Sumner then gives a geographic background on the Barbary States and then immediately compares the geography of the Barbary States to the southern states in the United States of America. As I mentioned, Sumner does not try to hide his ulterior motives for his research. He then goes to the history of slavery in general, saying that it is nothing new, and goes all the way back to biblical times. Sumner then admits that slavery has brought a tinge of good to the world, because he says captives in Africa used to be consumed by their captors or sacrificed to idols, and it is better now that they are sold into slavery instead of the ancient alternative. Sumner tells the story of Charles V, the King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. He freed some 20,000 Christian slaves from the Barbary States after taking military action against them. He did this in the year 1535, but Sumner points out in 1517 he had let 4,000 African slaves into the West Indies. Sumner writes, quote, "Thus, while the emperor leveled a mighty force to check the piracies of Barbarossa, and to produce the abolition of Christian slavery in Tunis, with a wretched inconsistency, he also laid the cornerstone of a new system of slavery in America, in comparison with which what he sought to suppress was trivial and fugitive." End quote. Sumner's narration shows that he blames all future American slaves on Emperor Charles. I would use Sumner's own numbers to argue against him, and say because Charles freed 20,000 slaves and allowed 4,000 slaves, he has 16,000 net slaves abolished. Sumner would disagree. Sumner continues on every interaction between Europe and the Barbary States. He quickly reaches 1620 when Europe dispatched ships to free English slaves. He writes, quote, "It was in the year 1620, while an English fleet was seeking the emancipation of Englishmen held in bondage by Algiers, that black slaves were first introduced into the English colonies of North America." End quote. You can already see a pattern in his formula. He gives a good history on the Christian slavery, but interjects every so often to point out the alleged hypocrisy of the African slave trade. He also goes over numerous stories of slaves escaping entirely on their own, which was the best part of the lecture to read because it was just back-to-back stories. One particular narrative goes as follows, with the captive saying, quote, "O hellish slavery, to be thus subject to dogs, O God, I strengthen my heart and hand, and something shall be done to ease us of these mischiefs, and deliver us from these cruel Mohammedan dogs. I will either attempt my deliverance at one time or another, or perish in the enterprise." An auspicious moment was seized, and 8 English slaves and 1 French, with the assistance of 4 Hollanders that were freemen, succeeded, after a bloody contest in overpowering 52 Turks. When all was done and the ship was cleared of the dead bodies, the leader assembled his men and with one consent gave the praise unto God. End quote. Sumner's historical narrative slows down when it gets to the 1780s because there were some events taking place closer to home that he describes in more detail. Sumner mentions one notorious treaty that America made with the Barbary States to free captives in the 1790s. In this treaty, it was declared that, quote, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion," end quote. This treaty was made by the American Joel Barlow. It makes sense that Barlow would claim this of the United States because he went to France to support the French Revolution, which is always a revealing action of how liberal someone is. Britannica states, quote, "In Paris, Barlow became a liberal in religion and an advanced Republican in politics." Barlow would not have felt any conviction in denying his own faith or the faith of a country he represented. Even the socially liberal Sumners provided context for the bold claim made by Barlow. He wrote that, quote, "The treaty was negotiated out of tenderness, perhaps, to Mohammedanism and to save our citizens from the slavery which was regarded as the just doom of Christian dogs." End quote. After giving the history of the American Barbary Wars, we reach the end of the historical narrative, the epic tale of Britain. Finally, after defeating Napoleon and freeing up their navy, they send their navy to the Barbary States, led by Lord Exmouth, to ultimately defeat them and end the entire Christian portion of the slave trade. Charles Sumner writes, quote, "Thus ended white slavery in the Barbary States. It had already died out in Morocco. It had been quietly renounced by Tripoli and Tunis. Its last retreat was Algiers, whence it was driven out amidst the thunder of the British cannon." End quote. If Sumner had ended there, it would have been an amazing, factual, and quick history of white slavery. But he extends his speech out 10 more pages in a 60-page speech to say that Americans should feel the same way about the American South as we do the Barbary States, and we should feel the same way about the African slave as we do the Christian slave. This is why I mentioned his background as a Unitarian, because it is the only way to adhere to the beliefs that Sumner is advocating for. You must believe that all religions are equal, all cultures are equal, and all forms of slavery are equal. This is a very modern belief, yet Sumner holds the entire past to his own moral framework. Sumner goes so far to call Lord Exmouth, the man who ended the Barbary Christian slave trade, unchristian, because he did nothing about the African slaves. Sumner states, "In confining the stipulation to the abolition of Christian slavery only, he made a discrimination, which, whether founded on religion or color, was selfish and unchristian." End quote. He continues, quote, "Lord Exmouth argued the freedom of all their fellow Christians without discrimination of nation, but they did not heed the slavery of others, Mahometans or idolaters, children of the same Father in heaven. Lord Exmouth did but half his work." End quote. If you are not a Christian or a liberal Christian, you may agree with all the claims Charles Sumner makes. If you are a mainline traditional Christian, you will disagree with Sumner because it is not consistent with historic theology. For the sake of defending Lord Exmouth, Charles V, and others that fall in Sumner's line of fire, I will briefly explain why Sumner's claims are not consistent with Christian teachings. Number 1. Mahometans and idolaters are not children of the Father according to the Bible. They are created by God, but in order to be a child of God, you must accept him as your Father in heaven. Number 2. The reason that Europeans and Americans would enslave Africans and not other Europeans was because it was seen as fulfilling Christ's teaching to spread the gospel or the good news. There are many examples of this, but one popular case is the essay, "The Negro Christianized," an essay to excite and insist that good work, the instruction of Negro servants in Christianity. You do not necessarily have to agree with this particular strategy of evangelism, but regardless, it resulted in millions of Africans becoming Christian and was seen as a positive development during its time. Lastly, number 3, the Bible never outright condemns slavery. It's important to note it never recommends slavery either, but Lord Exmouth did nothing that was unchristian when he did not negotiate the freedom of African slaves in Algiers, and it's blasphemy for Charles Sumner to claim that it was. Sumner goes on to make his most explicitly false claim. He says that slavery was more humane in the Barbary States than it was in the United States. He does cite many sources for this in rapid succession, but they are extremely cherry-picked to make Barbary slavery sound like heaven on earth. He quotes a few Americans like William Eaton, who said Barbary slaves were treated more humanely. Eaton said that in the same paragraph, where he also mentions Christian slaves dying of grief and others living out a life less tolerable than death. You can come to your own conclusions if that is truly worse than slavery in America. Charles Sumner lists a ton of examples, including quotes from Don Quixote, but in essence, his stance is, quote, that the captives were well clad and well fed, that they were allowed opportunities of Christian worship, that they were often treated with leniency and affectionate care, that they were sometimes advanced to posts of responsibility and honor, end quote. The only bad thing that Charles Sumner concedes is that the female Christian slaves were all taken as concubines for their Algerine masters, which sort of disproves his entire claim of humane treatment, but I will provide evidence to directly disprove his bold claim. You can always find outliers, but if we go off generalities, All these claims, besides one, are verifiably false. First, for food and clothing. Based on primary sources, even the radical Frederick Douglass in his narrative proves that they received almost double the food and clothing as their Barbary counterparts. On the claim that Christians could freely worship, he is referring to the Lazarus priests, which was a European Catholic mission group sent specifically to relieve the suffering of Christian slaves. It was a reactionary group because Christians were not being treated well or being allowed to worship God. They set up a total of 5 chapels in 2 of the Barbary states. Other evidence shows many Christians converted to Islam because then they would be set free. So Christian slaves in the Barbary states were encouraged to convert to Islam, but because of dedicated Catholics, some of them were able to remain faithful. That is a very different narrative than Sumner tells. In order to refute the claim that the Muslims treated Christian slaves with leniency and affectionate care, I will just quote his own lecture from a few pages before. Quote, "One of the slaves made an unsuccessful attempt to escape, which had drawn upon him the punishment of the bastinado, disabling him from work for a 12-month. End quote. Many of his stories of slaves escaping began by saying the conditions were harsh. This is the most laughable of his claims by how outrageous it is. No, Muslim slavery was not affectionate. The final claims that slaves had mobility and could gain honorable positions is true, but still, some of these positions were granted to benefit the Dey or the leader of the country. For example, James Cathcart, the American ship captain who was enslaved, had an honorable position, but it was given to him to help negotiate a deal with America to buy all their freedom with a large sum of money. So he was only given the position to profit the Dey. Despite Charles Sumner really wanting us to believe, a vast majority of the evidence proves that Barbary slavery was harsher and morally worse, even from Sumner's own made-up morality. If I were to make the argument quickly, I would say the African slaves in the Barbary states were castrated in large numbers, and of the women, they were sold as sex slaves. Those 2 facts alone should prove the barbarity of the Barbary states' slavery. Please note that all the sources I used on the screen were found on the internet. I just wanted to show how easy it was to disprove. If I wanted a more thorough deconstruction of his claims, then I could have pulled out the book White Slaves and Muslim Masters, or other books for more detail. It is unclear how much reach the pamphlet of this lecture had or if it ever got popular, but it is very clear that Sumner used his knowledge of Christian slavery and gave a factual telling of the history, but he interlaid the historical narrative with false, anti-American South propaganda. Sumner twisted the truth and then made an appeal to Christians to oppose American slavery, when he himself had zero Christian ground to stand on, as he did not believe in Jesus, Holy Scripture, or the Trinity. Thank you for watching and listening. This was Americanism Zoomer, and I will catch you on my next video.